Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we've got the first in a series of videos where we're going to see what it would take to sink an Iowa-class battleship. We're going to compare the damage sustained by other contemporary battleships and see if New Jersey could have handled that better or worse. We're going to start off with the Pearl Harbor battleships. Could New Jersey have survived the attack on Pearl Harbor? So, for the purposes of this video, we're going to take out the 8 standard type battleships that were in Pearl Harbor, and we're going to replace them with 8 Iowa-class battleships. So let's start with the lesser damaged Pearl Harbor battleships. Pennsylvania was in dry dock during the attack and received moderate damage. I believe she was hit by a single bomb hit. The bomb was probably the same type that destroyed Arizona, a modified Japanese 16-inch naval shell turned into an armor-piercing bomb. And in Pennsylvania's case, that bomb failed to penetrate the ship's armored deck, and while it did some damage, it didn't sink her. Despite being in dry dock, Pennsylvania sustained moderate damage. It was able to easily be repaired. The most significant damage the ship received was from the destroyers Cassin and Downs, which were in dry dock with her. These ships suffered magazine explosions that threw debris, such as a heavy torpedo tube, into the forecastle of Pennsylvania, and caused fires, which spread to the battleship. This led to the dry dock being flooded, which fortunately Pennsylvania had neither received work to her hull nor received damage to her hull, and so she was able to be refloated without any damage. She had to be set back into dry dock to replace the 3 propellers which had been removed while she was in dry dock prior to the attack, but the bomb hole and the fire damage was rapidly patched up and she was back in service in no time. Had an Iowa-class battleship been in that dry dock, there wouldn't have been room for the destroyers. The bomb damage would have been no more severe on an Iowa than it was on Pennsylvania, and so our hypothetical Iowa-class battleship in the dry dock would have made it through the attack unscathed. Maryland and Tennessee were both moored inboard of other battleships on Battleship Row. Each received 2 bomb hits. In Maryland's case, there was a bomb that hit directly in the forecastle and another near miss that hit near the bow of the ship. Those damages may have been even worse on New Jersey than they were on Maryland. Maryland was a relatively short and tubby vessel, as were all the standard type battleships. If you look at them from the top, they look like wide canoes. New Jersey's shell plating at the bow is only about a ½ inch thick, and there's no armor plating there because she falls under the all-or-nothing armor scheme. So either a near miss at the bow or a direct hit at the bow near the forecastle is probably going to punch through several decks, and if it detonates, it would probably blow through the side of the ship and cause flooding. This flooding would not be severe, and it would not endanger the ship in any way. Even if our hypothetical Iowa was not at general quarters and did not have all of her watertight doors sealed, like was the case with many of the Pearl Harbor battleships. Regardless, the damage would have been very easy to weld plates over and get the ship back in the fight. Tennessee likewise took 2 armor-piercing bomb hits. One hit the top of turret number 3 and was able to defeat the 5-inch armor and detonate inside the turret, damaging 2 of the rammers. New Jersey had 7-inch armor on her turret tops, and that bomb probably wouldn't have penetrated. Another bomb hit the turret top of number 1 turret at the bow, exploded, and managed to damage one of the gun barrels in turret number 2. New Jersey's gun barrel would have also been damaged and would have had to been replaced just like Tennessee's, but the ship's ability to float and fight would not have been endangered in any way. Next on our list is the Battleship Nevada. Nevada already had steam built up for an inspection that morning, and so our hypothetical Iowa with steam pressure built up would have likely been able to get underway just like Nevada did. Nevada took a torpedo, a Type 91 torpedo, and took a bomb hit or two while she was tied up on Battleship Row. But it was when she got underway that she became a major target, and several of the Japanese dive bombers, which had roughly 500 to 600 pound bombs on them, diverted from their initial targets to attack the battleship underway. Was Nevada a threat to their ships? No, she didn't have any powder loaded on board for her main battery guns. While most of the American battleships were fully fueled and loaded with ammunition, Nevada had been swapping out her older ammunition for a new type, and the job wasn't done yet. And so she was not able to fire her main guns much, but she also wasn't in any danger of catastrophically exploding like Arizona did. These dive bombers swarmed Nevada while she was underway and peppered her superstructure with armor-piercing bombs. These bombs were not heavy enough to punch through her armored deck, which was her main deck about 5 inches thick, whereas an Iowa-class battleship has a main deck of 1.5 inches to detonate bombs like that, and then a 6-inch deck underneath to contain the explosion. And so New Jersey would have likely been not undamaged, but certainly not threatened. The bomb damage did cause fires, primarily on second deck where officers and berthing spaces were filled with combustible materials, and that would have been just as likely to spread on an Iowa-class battleship. Eventually, fearing that Nevada could be sunk in the channel and potentially bottle up the U.S. fleet in Pearl Harbor, she was run aground. An Iowa-class battleship may not have sustained enough damage from those bomb attacks to severely threaten the ship. And with a speed nearly 50% higher than Nevada, may well have been able to clear the channel entrance at high speed and make it out into the open ocean. I really respect the decision by Nevada's commanding officer to run her aground. If the ship sunk in port, or ran aground in port, as the case was, she would be easy to salvage. If the ship somehow made it into deep water and was then sunk, she's a total loss. And it would be possible that our high-speed Iowa makes it out to sea only to be swarmed by Japanese torpedo planes and sunk and lost forever. So running her aground may be the better course of action. That said, if the ship does get underway and out to sea, then she can maneuver and buy herself some time to bring all of her guns on board, online. And New Jersey does have a significantly better anti-aircraft battery than any of the Pearl Harbor battleships. Maybe she could have survived the attack. Next up, let's look at the battleship West Virginia. She was the most damaged battleship to be returned to service. She took some 5 bomb hits and 7 torpedo hits. That's a lot even for an Iowa-class battleship. 7 torpedo hits on one side caused the ship to start to roll over. Fortunately, an officer was able to order damage control parties to counterflood and cause her to sink on an even keel. The 5 bomb hits, again, were negligible and didn't penetrate the armored deck. While they did significant damage to the ship and caused fires, they didn't impact the ship's ability to float. The ship also received significant damage when Arizona exploded, and fires from that ship and fires from the fuel oil leaking out, burning all around West Virginia, caused much of the fantail to catch on fire. And fires spread through the inside of the ship because she wasn't sealed up in any sort of battle readiness. Iowa-class battleships actually had less subdivision in their engineering spaces than the earlier battleships. And so if they had started to take flooding in engineering spaces, that flooding would have been concentrated in the center part of the ship. It wouldn't have been on one side like on West Virginia. She tended to have boiler rooms and other machinery spaces on both sides of the ships, with more engineering spaces in the middle. So sure, flooding the torpedo defense would have caused one side of the ship to be heavier, but if the torpedo bulkhead was defeated, then that flooding might allow the ship to sink on a relatively even keel, even without quick damage control action. That number of torpedo hits would almost certainly sink an Iowa-class battleship just as much as it did West Virginia. But the Iowa-class battleship, I think, would have been even more likely to go down on an even keel and be salvageable. At the forward end of Battleship Row was California. She took 2 bomb hits and 2 torpedo hits, and because the ship was opened up for inspection, she sunk and again was in danger of rolling over like West Virginia. Again, I don't think an Iowa would have been in as much damage, and the 2 torpedo hits probably wouldn't have sunk an Iowa to begin with. Their torpedo defense was rated for closer to 6 torpedoes needed to destroy the ship. Even though the Japanese Type 91 torpedo may have had as much of a 1,000-pound warhead on it, it probably wouldn't have, and that was more than U.S. Navy designers had expected to see. The 2 torpedoes probably wouldn't have been enough to sink her. Part of the issue with West Virginia and California was they were overloaded. So the torpedoes, instead of hitting on their excellent 5-layer torpedo defense, which is very similar to New Jersey's, they hit on the armored belt. The armored belt is rigid, the torpedo defense is soft. They had exterior belts that the torpedo defense was mounted to the bottom of, so a torpedo hit there left the belt mostly intact, but sheared the shell plating away from the bottom of the armored belt. And this allowed for massive flooding into the torpedo defense system. The Iowas, with their internal belt and with a belt that goes all the way to the triple bottom, likely would not have encountered that type of shearing and probably wouldn't have seen as much progressive flooding. Speaking of flooding, let's move next to the battleship Oklahoma, which was hit by as many as 9 torpedoes, some of which even hit the vessel in her decks as she rolled over. Talk about overkill. 9 torpedoes would have almost certainly been enough to sink an Iowa-class battleship. Oklahoma was one of the oldest battleships at Pearl Harbor. She and Nevada were the oldest ones there. And the torpedo defense on that vessel was very much an afterthought added on in the 1930s. 9 torpedoes on one side of the ship may well have been enough to cause an Iowa-class battleship to roll over and sink. Odds are that some of those torpedoes were hitting close enough together that one would create a hole and the next torpedo would be able to exploit that hole to explode even deeper in the ship. And that would cause even greater flooding and defeat the torpedo system even more. If an Iowa-class battleship had rolled over, they draw 10 feet more water than Oklahoma did with a 28-foot draft. And so they may not have rolled over all the way like Oklahoma did. They might have just rolled on the side. I don't know if that helps salvaging or not. There's a good chance that the ship wouldn't have rolled over. Because those engineering spaces are open, she would have, and she was already deeper in the water, she might have just sunk into the mud on an even keel and been able to be restored. As it was, Oklahoma was rolled back over and righted, and she was being towed back to the mainland, probably to be scrapped, almost certainly not to be salvaged. But she sank while under tow. So that means that and Iowa would have probably been able to be righted if they were able to right Oklahoma, and they would have probably patched her up to send her back to the mainland. As a much newer vessel, they might have tried to salvage this hypothetical Iowa as opposed to Oklahoma, which was a total write-off. And that brings us to the final battleship at Pearl Harbor, USS Arizona, which took a modified 16-inch shell turned into an armor-piercing bomb in her forward magazine. The explosion of the forward magazine ripped the ship in half and caused much of the forward superstructure to collapse and caused the ship to sink. I don't think it's likely that that bomb hit would have penetrated the armored deck on an Iowa-class battleship. With the exception of that hit on Arizona, none of the other bomb hits that I'm aware of managed to penetrate the armored decks on any of the other standard-type battleships, and their deck armor was significantly weaker than the Iowa's. Maybe it was a fluke that destroyed Arizona, and a similar fluke could have destroyed an Iowa, maybe because of inspections and armored hatches left open and the bomb is able to go through the main armored deck and explode inside. If that 16-inch bomb hits a main battery powder magazine, that's probably the ball game, even for an Iowa. I can't think of any battleships that could survive a magazine explosion like that and be expected to return to service. But I don't think without a fluke that the bomb could penetrate the main armored deck. Remember, battleships are armored against the type of shells that they carry. So Arizona with 14-inch shells was armored against 14-inch guns, and she was effectively sunk by a 16-inch shell. New Jersey carried 16-inch guns, and so was armored against 16-inch guns, and could have probably stopped that 16-inch shell. So we've talked about if the ship's armor could survive those sorts of attack. Could the ship's anti-aircraft guns have prevented these attacks from happening? If we're assuming that the ship is at the same condition of readiness as the other Pearl Harbor battleships, likely she would have taken early damage before her anti-aircraft guns could have swung into action. The Pearl Harbor battleships tended to have 8 5-inch guns, 4 medium anti-aircraft guns, whether 3 inches or 1.1-inch Chicago pianos, although on some of the ships like Arizona these weren't fitted, and then 8 50 caliber machine guns. This is utterly insignificant. An Iowa-class battleship with 20 dual-purpose 5-inch guns and radar-controlled rangefinders and veritably timed fuses, 80 40mm guns, and about 49 20mm guns would have been able to put up a heck of a lot more flak than any of the Pearl Harbor battleships, assuming the crew gets to general quarters and is able to do this. Some of the Pearl Harbor battleships had a quarter of their anti-aircraft guns manned and served with 50 rounds of ready service ammunition. Typically in peacetime, the ready service lockers are empty, but on at least some of the battleships, this ammunition was in place and these gunners were able to return fire quickly. It did take time between when they fired those first 50 shots and when the magazines were able to be unlocked or broken open and gun crews were able to get there and more ammo was able to be raised. But with a quarter of New Jersey's guns in action, she could have probably prevented any significant damage. The fuses of American shells at Pearl Harbor in particular were an issue. You had to hand set where you wanted them to explode based on your fire control solution, and really was more effective at putting up a barrage to deter enemy aircraft from flying through your flak to attack your ship. Of course, by the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, these aircraft are already inside of flak range, and many of the fuses set on the American ships were either set too short, so they exploded before reaching the Japanese aircraft, or they were set too long, so the shells went up in the air, missed the aircraft, landed in Honolulu, and exploded among the civilian population. Veritably timed fuses, which essentially have a small radar in the nose cone that explodes when it senses an enemy aircraft, would have done a world of good for those ships. And even with only a quarter of her battery manned, New Jersey could have probably defended herself for a period of time while the rest of the crew got to general quarters. Let's say it's not a World War II Iowa at Pearl Harbor. Let's say it's a Vietnam-era Iowa. The ship likely had some .50 caliber machine guns mounted on the rails, and small arms such as the M60, which was essentially a .30 caliber belt-fed machine gun. And she still had her 20 dual-purpose 5-inch guns, but again, with aircraft at close range, and none of the medium and short-range 40mm and 20mm guns that the ship had in World War II and Korea, New Jersey would have been much more of a sitting duck. Let's say it's a 1980s New Jersey in Pearl Harbor. The Iowa-class battleships are said to have been armed with 5 Stinger missile launchers, which I've never seen any evidence of them being carried on this ship. However, if you read Summerall's book, you'll see that they are listed in there. The Stinger missiles are a shoulder-fired weapon that would probably be able to easily lock onto and destroy a Japanese aircraft. They also had the 4 20mm phalanx Gatling guns, and these would have absolutely chewed through Japanese aircraft for as long as they had ammunition. The phalanx carries a very small amount of ammunition that it can expend in under a minute. It is an excellent system in that you just turn it on and it will engage targets, but it's very, very susceptible to swarm tactics. And with over 350 aircraft attacking Pearl Harbor, I'd say that counts as a swarm. So after roughly a minute of firing each of its 4 phalanx guns, New Jersey then has no functional anti-aircraft guns for the next 15 minutes while those are being loaded. She does still have 12 of her 5-inch guns, and they can in theory still be used as dual-purpose weapons, although I'm not aware of any instance in the 1980s when they were used for that, and I'm not sure that the crew in the 1980s trained to do that because they were relatively ineffective against the types of aerial targets that would be engaging the ship, i.e. missiles and jet aircraft. A 1980s New Jersey would probably shoot down the most Japanese aircraft, but without putting up any sort of effective flak, it would not be deterring Japanese attacks, and I think would be less effective at protecting the ship than the World War II era ship that's at least putting up flak clouds and driving off Japanese aircraft, if not outright destroying them. So, like I said earlier, this is the first in a series of videos. Let us know what you think about it. What sorts of damage do you want to see if an Iowa-class battleship could survive? And do you agree with our assessments on if New Jersey could survive more effectively than the older battleships at Pearl Harbor? Let us know in the comments section. We do read that very often. The battleship receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State and also from viewers like you. If you would like to support the museum and our YouTube channel, please check the description below for a link to our GoFundMe campaign. Anything you donate there not only supports the museum, but it directly supports our YouTube channel and the work we do. That allows us to put out multiple videos a week, so make sure you like, share, and subscribe so you're notified when we're putting out new content. Thanks for watching.